Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor.
And I'm Kelly.
And we are the co-hosts of Jumping Bomb Audio, the #1 show all about the world of Joshi Pro Wrestling. Episodes drop every other Monday where we discuss the biggest Joshi news, review shows, and preview the hottest upcoming Joshi action.
So whether you're a new fan or an old fan, we've got something here for you at Jumping Bomb Audio.
Check us out on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network.
Most tax pros leave a message.
It's Jane. I'm moving on to a TurboTax expert who beat your price. Adam Devine, tell him how I feel.
Hey, tax pro, she's been thinking twice. Best believe TurboTax will beat your price. This is a tax break.
Switch to a TurboTax Live expert and we'll beat what you paid your pro last tax season. Make the switch at TurboTax.com/beatyourprice. TurboTax full service only. Sign up by 12/20/2024 and file by 4/1/2025. Full details at TurboTax.com/beatyourprice.
This podcast is a member of the Voices of Wrestling Podcasting Network. Visit voicesofwrestling.com to hear the rest of our great podcasts, as well as show reviews, columns, opinions, and updates across the world of wrestling.
To the highway in a brand new day. Gotta let it go. Fast to finger down. Dance tonight together. Here everyone is singing. 你看到我就怕，头皮发麻，我的手。
Welcome back to Open the Voice Gate for October 15th, 2024. We are members of the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network. You could find us on the Voices of Wrestling Podcast Network feed or on our own dedicated Open the Voice Gate feed on all podcast platforms and applications. You can follow us on Twitter at Open Voice Gate. If you'd like to donate to the show, you can click the link in the show notes. It'll take you to our redcircle.com landing site. You click the red box that says sponsor this podcast, and you can set up a one-time or recurring donation. No obligation whatsoever, but we would like to thank all of our previous donors. I'm one of your hosts. It's your old pal, Mike Spears, joined alongside, as always, Case Lowe. And Case, I'm just going to hand the ball straight off to you, man. This is your baby of this special episode we're doing this week.
Well, I thank you, Mike. I'm looking forward to the next 2 weeks on this show because tonight we have a special guest who I'll introduce in just a second. Next week, at your usual time, we'll have a J episode. So Gate of Destiny preview, Konomama Ichikawa retirement thoughts, and then a bunch of pending questions that Mike and I have that we really want to talk to Jay about, some Toryumon X stuff, among other things. So it's a loaded 2 weeks here, but we have a first-time guest on Open the Voice Gate tonight. It is my pleasure as we talk about Gran Hamada and his Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Fame candidacy as he is back on the ballot this year in the Mexico region specifically. We have the one and only, the Cubs fan, the Lucha Blog. Cubs, welcome to the show. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for doing this. You know, Mike and I, over the last few years, mainly with Alan Forel, when we were doing a Greatest Wrestler Ever project in 2021, we did a ton of audio on Hamada, but, you know, that was a project that focused solely on the in-ring aspect of his career. And we'll talk about some of the great matches he's had towards the end of this podcast. But with Hamada being back on the ballot and being in the Mexico region, something that, you know, I have a ballot, but I do not vote in Mexico. Mike, famously blackballed from having a ballot, does not have one, so he can't vote in even if he wanted to. We thought we'd bring you on to essentially tell the story of Hamada's career through the lens of drawing power, through the lens of influence, through the lens of match quality. And we'll start with his time in Mexico. We'll end with his time in Japan. And hopefully, if you are hearing this, whether you're a usual listener or somebody that's just diving in for the sake of it being Observer Hall of Fame season, we can all come to a greater understanding of Gran Hamada and the career that was, because, you know, up top, I feel comfortable saying that all three of us are passionate fans of Gran Hamada, think he should already be in the Hall of Fame, and at least in my case, am a little perturbed that he's not. So I want to start with just an overview, Cubs, of when you were introduced to Hamada. Do you remember the first time you saw him wrestle? And when did you begin to learn about his history and the cachet that he has in Mexico specifically?
It's strange because by the time I started getting into Lucha Libre, Hamada was not an active participant in Mexico anymore. I was trying to think back this week. When was the first time I would have actually seen him? And it might have been like something like as incidental as AAA was doing a Fabio Apache, a Yako Hamada feud, and they had both of their fathers involved. So I think Hamada, in my mind, he wrestled at that part, but checking in my database, he never actually had a match in AAA at that point, but he probably just got involved in some match. And then I would have gone back and seen some of the stuff around the Michinoku Pro's appearance in ECW around Barely Legal, but I was not someone who was a tape trader at all. That's like half the reason I end up being in Mexican wrestling, because I didn't need the tape trade to see it. So I would have known Hamada, but I really didn't see a lot of his stuff except when it would when the matches were turned up on New Japan World from the 1970s of UWA or other incidental ways. It was more learning about his career when I was doing a lot of magazine research in the last few years, where I literally got into his history and his meaning in Mexico.
Yeah, on Twitter every once in a while, I like when you post these old magazine, for lack of a better term, screen grabs, just because it represents a bygone era and an era that we sadly don't have tape of. And I do think with Hamada, it's an interesting thing where I think for a long time there was a misconception that most of his career wasn't on tape, and that's not true. We are just sadly missing, almost the first part of his career, a lot of the 70s work in Mexico. And, as we'll talk about, he wrestled in All Japan in 1984 for the entire year, and we only have one match on tape from that run, which is such a bummer because the match that we have is good. So, but there's, a little bit of his UWA stuff out there in the 80s. There's a lot, thanks to Roy Lucier, of readily available UWA early 1990s stuff. There's the Michinoku Pro stuff that circulates pretty well. There's the Universal Lucha Libre stuff that, prior to archive.org going down, circulated incredibly well. Now it's a little bit harder to find, but luckily as we go along and I reference some matches, we'll have links for those in the description. So, you talked about Hamada and a lot of your, for lack of a better term, fascination with him coming through these magazines. So can you explain how Hamada ended up in Mexico, when he first went there, and how immediate his impact was there?
Hamada ended up in Mexico around July 1975. What was going on is that a bunch of wrestlers and a couple of prominent promoters were breaking away from EMLL, which had been the monopolistic promotion in Mexico for the last 20 years, and trying to start their own thing just outside Mexico City. And they went through a whole bunch of names before selling on to everyone knowing their titles as the UWA. But the big goal at first was to try to pull even with EML, because EML had the deal with the NWA, and that made them some sort of part of a global network. So the new group wanted to also say, oh yeah, we have all these global partners as well. So as part of that, they talked about working with people in the US and working with people in Europe and working with people in Japan. And I think in trying to emphasize that they were a worldwide organization, they brought in Gran Hamada and a couple of other Japanese wrestlers making a deal with New Japan, which also gave them an edge because EML, they would bring in a couple of people from NWA, but they were not spending their money that way. So Hamada comes in because the UWA wants to show that they're international, and also the UWA does not really have a great depth in roster. They have some older veterans from EML who felt like they were going to get pushed out. They have some really young guys like early Blonde, early Connect, who are eventually going to be big deals for them, but they're not ready to be top people. So Hamada comes in. He's a fresh face. He's a person that Mexican fans do not know anything about, and he's also a guy who's got a good background based on this New Japan training. He's ready to contribute right away, and so just to make a new star, and because they got someone they could work with, they immediately pushed him onto the top. Within 3 weeks of him coming to Mexico, he beats Rene Guerrero, which is a legendary Mexican wrestler and one of the guys who was leading this breakaway group. Hamada beats Guerrero in a hair versus hair match, which is just like one of these shocking upsets. It's a main event of a bull ring show that draws 11,000 fans, and despite having a torrential rainstorm during the show, they keep him on top through most of the next year, where Guerrero, it takes him a while to get that win back. He and a fellow New Japan trainee, I'm not sure exactly if I pronounced his name right, Hashim Masataka, who does not really go on to have a great career, but they're both pushed a bit. Hamada's pushed more, but it turns out Hamada's a lot better. They also win another hair match in November, and they just go on a strong streak of main eventing shows and getting big wins as not even like these evil foreigners, but respected technicals who had great ability in that first year. And while we don't have drawing records for all the shows, we can see that they're main eventing all these shows, so they must be working to some degree.
Absolutely. Am I correct in that none of the Hamada and Guajardo matches, we don't have footage of any of that stuff, do we?
We do not have footage of that stuff. They would have done those matches in Mexico City in Mexico City and just outside Mexico City. Obviously, Mexico City stuff, that was the point where Lucha Libre wasn't allowed to be put on TV, so they were required to tape it. They would have also done in Monterrey, where there was some TV at that point, but none of that has ever turned up from that period.
That's a bummer. You posted a photo of a bloody Guajardo on your Twitter a while back from a match with Hamada that made me really, really want to dive into that stuff. Something we'll talk about as we go along is, Hamada's in-ring style and his build are both so unique. And, his in-ring style, I think, paved the way for a lot. Mike will cover a lot of that stuff here momentarily. But when Hamada gets to Mexico, we're, again, like you said, we're talking 75, we're talking early days of this UWA project. Does he, at least from what you can gather from history, does he stick out like a sore thumb on these cards? Are there wrestlers working as fast as him or doing aerial moves like him? I don't know, by and large, what the house style would have been like when he got to Mexico.
It's tough to say because it's the beginning of a new promotion, so that promotion didn't really have a huge house style. But one of the other big differences between EML and UWA, which is not actually its name, but I'm just going to keep saying that, because only the Lucha freaks would really get upset when we do that, is that EML did not push the lightweights. They pushed the smaller guys, which Hamada kind of fits into. But UWA saw that there were a bunch of lightweights who were available on the indie scene and brought them up and started using those guys to fill out their shows. And that did become they did eventually have a faster pace matches and more high spots and that sort of thing. But they did not get there at first, because at first they still were relying on veterans and new guys and stuff. So I think Hamada, I don't know if I want to get credit for influencing the UWA style, but what he was kind of doing served as kind of the model of stuff that they would be bringing in over the next 5-10 years.
Do you think, and tell me if you don't think so, I don't want to lead you to an answer that you don't agree with, but in the same way that when Riki Choshu comes into All Japan in the mid-'80s, it's a deal where, he speeds up that entire roster. And for somebody like Tenryu, he adapted to it very quickly. For somebody like Jumbo, he struggled to do it more so. And because Jumbo was the leader of that pack, it almost seems like through 85, especially, like Jumbo he can't keep up with the pace, and thus he's slowing down All Japan. Do you look at Hamada as a Choshu-esque figure in the sense that, like, hey, nobody was doing what he was doing at the speed he was doing it before he got there?
I think no one was doing it at the speed he was doing it who was actually getting pushed. So,
okay.
Looking through, as I read through the 1970 magazines, you could see all these, you can see various like opening match, match 2, match 3 kind of people who like the name seemed familiar, and then once you look it up, you realize it's someone who got a mask gimmick about 7 years later, who actually we're trying to do faster stuff. We're trying to do different stuff, but they weren't the right guy that EML was going to push. But Hamada getting pushed to that top, I think helped a little bit, opened doors for other people to like. If it works with him, we're trying it with him, and now we can replicate this with other people, or they're more willing to accept that style as a top guy as opposed to just a prelim kind of way to work.
So contextualize this for me, because he gets pushed very quickly, and we're talking 75 here. And you compiled a spreadsheet on Twitter at this time last year that was houses that Hamada had worked either the main event or the semi-main event for that drew over 10,000 people, by and large, until you get to his own promotion in Japan. And there's a lot of promotions, or I'm sorry, a lot of shows where Hamada, if he's not working the main event, he's working the semi-main event on these 15,000 people houses, these 17,000 people houses, the 18,000 people houses. There's a match that sticks out to me, and maybe this is the match that can contextualize Hamada's star power in Mexico at this time for those that are unaware. In '83, Hulk Hogan comes to Japan, or I'm sorry, he comes to Mexico, and it's Connect and Perro Aguayo against Hulk Hogan and Gran Hamada. Did Hamada stick out as like, oh, that's the fourth guy that I know the match ends in a DQ, but like, oh, he's there to take the fall, or he's there to just get beat up and to bump and to make Hogan look good? Or was he looked at as equal star power to those guys in that specific match?
I think, without being there, it's always tough to say, but I think he was looked at equal star power because he and Aguayo had feuded off and on since Aguayo had jumped to the promotion in 1979. Mm-hmm. So those guys, Aguayo goes on to become a much bigger star over time, but I think because those were evenly matched rivals, I think those guys have been looked at the same level in that match.
Okay, yeah, that's kind of the impression that I got, and that is high on the list of Holy Grail matches, just to see what Hogan and Hamada looked like standing next to each other. That is really a fascinating thing to think about. Speaking of Aguayo, do you consider him to be Hamada's most iconic opponent? They have a long-running feud. They have a bunch of stuff in Japan that makes tape. They end up teaming together towards the end of their run in Universal Lucha Libre in Japan. They have a lot of tag matches that I actually quite enjoy. But when I think of Hamada, unless I'm contextualizing him just as one of the guys in the Michinoku Pro, Sekigun, and Kaientai feud, I tend to think of him with Aguayo.
I think because of the first we have, I think Aguayo seems like the biggest rival, and I think it's a solid argument he is. I think Guerrero probably would be up there. Like the big piece of the puzzle we're missing with that feud is that Guerrero helps form the UWA near Mexico City, but he's also starts his own promotion in Monterrey, and we have very, very limited records of how that did. But they were running an 11,000 seat building like every Sunday. And I am sure Guerrero, just from the stuff that we have, Guerrero and Hamada have been the main feud up there, and Hamada would have made a bend there a few more times. So I think for that first few years, it was probably Guerrero as big rival. And then once Guerrero retires from in-ring, it becomes Aguayo, and I think the Aguayo one goes a lot longer. I think Volano 3, he had a lot of matches with Babyface. He also feuded a bit with, but it would be Aguayo and Guerrero would be the two big ones.
One of the questions I did the Voices of Wrestling flagship Patreon last year. I talked to Rich and Joe about the Japan section, and Joe, had a line of questioning for me about Shima that made me feel like I was on trial defending OJ. It was very intense. I got very nervous during the entire thing. But we were talking about reasonably how many houses of a certain number you could attribute to Shima being the main reason that people attended these shows. And obviously with Dragon Gate, and I think this and most of the people listening know this, but they're a company that deals in mass amount of shows, not volume of people at certain shows, but throughout various points, whether it was very early on at Toryumon or peak Dragon Gate, which can happen at a few different points in their history. they've packed some buildings. They've packed some very big buildings. Do you feel comfortable attributing, I don't want to put a specific number on it, but let's just say, do you feel comfortable attributing multiple 10,000 plus person houses to Gran Hamada in some form or fashion?
I think so, because I think he had that early run. I think because the one advantage that he has from going to UWA is that they ran those big buildings. They started out with the Palacio de los Portes in Mexico City, and then they moved to Rio. So they're running like 20,000 seat buildings once a week, sometimes even more than once a week. And so he had plenty of, they would, as a guy who was in the top mix, he would plenty of times to main event those buildings. And I think he got over 10,000, or he was a critical part of shows that went over 10,000 plenty of times.
Okay. All right. That's a very good anecdote there. Brief aside, this will tie back into Hamada, but I've talked a little bit on the show recently about how one of my big viewing projects as of late is starting with AAA at the beginning of 1993 and watching all of the TV that's out there. And I'll go through 95 or 96 just whenever I get bored with it. But right now I'm in the middle of 93. And so I've immersed myself through the footage that's out there and through the Observer archives of just Lucha in 1992 and 93 and 94. And obviously, the advent of AAA in part leads to the downfall of the UWA. Can you explain to me Hamada's role in the dying days of the UWA? So I don't know if you want to earmark that as 91, 92, 93. Do you look at that as a blemish of him as a draw, that he was considered to be one of the top stars of a promotion that died out? Just, can you help contextualize that era of Lucha just a little bit for me?
Yeah, I don't know if I think if we were to blame specific wrestlers in the UWA for the downfall in that early 90s period, I'm not even sure if blaming the wrestlers themselves would be like the top priority, but I wouldn't put Hamada at the top of that mix. I think he, if anything, was probably a guy who his problem was more that he was too loyal to a dying group, and if he had made a stronger move to one of the other two promotions or found a home in Japan, he probably would have been better off than seeing that go on as long as he did. I would put like people like Funaki as a bigger issue because he was more stronger on top. He had more creative control, and his time had passed, but he was like the last person to realize it, and even 30 years later, he has not realized it. But the bigger issue was always going to be that like the Mexico City TV ban ended. Email got the Televisa slot. UWA got a week show on a week network. And even if AAA never came along, that UWA was going to look so second rate and lesser, and that the TV was going to kill their touring business, which it ended up doing for both promotions, where they ended up running a lot less shows by the mid 90s, that the UWA was going to be much worse off for it. It was, I think I put it down to a lack of a leadership or lack of anticipation of what the next trends were going to be by UWA management, more than I put to any of these specific wrestlers.
Okay, that's very interesting. Do you think, because I help me with the timeline a little bit, because he works UWA basically until they go away, which it's funny reading the Observers at that time period, because there's like a months long stretch where it's EMLL, AAA reports, and then Dave gets to UWA. He's like, it's not looking good. I don't know how long they're gonna last. But after UWA, he ends up in AAA for a little bit in 1994, and I believe that's it. The larger point here is there anything he does in Mexico in the 90s specifically that you think might help his Hall of Fame candidacy? Or is it all like UWA is just dying on the vine and it's all just like, hey, maybe there's some cool matches here, but it's not really anything that we would attribute to the Hall of Fame?
I think there's not anything really that big in the 90s that would help. If I'm remembering right, and I may not be, that like even in 1994 was like some sort of UWA AAA partnership that lasted not that long. Mm-hmm. But because the UWA dies, because he sticks with it, there's not that many opportunities to have those great matches, and there's not like the promotion where no one's drawing and it's not easy to be seen, and so I don't think there's much past that point that's really going to help his candidacy.
Okay,
It's
interesting.
it's something where the more I kind of look at his career, and especially like what applies to UWA, I feel like somehow it kind of ripples through, like, Hamada's Universal, and it seemed, and then with him in Impro and how long he sticks with that promotion, it seems like that he is someone who kind of throughout at least that period from basically Hamada's Universal through 96, 97, you're seeing someone who kind of just, I don't call it like snake bit by promotions in a way, just things do not kind of break the way that one would have hoped for him, and how he's kind of, it seems like that, like the UWA stuff is happening at a time where of course Hamada's Universal's falling apart, and Impro is just like 92 through 94 feels like a very turbulent time for him professionally.
Yeah, I kind of almost wonder if the reason why he stuck with UWA so long is because he thought he was going to get Universal going, and so it was not worth his effort. He wasn't going to be around long enough in AAA or CML to make an impression there. And then once that doesn't work out, he doesn't have much left on the Mexico side either, so he's kind of stuck.
Yeah, okay, that all makes sense. Legacy-wise, I want to ask you this, because it's weird because Hamada is in the Mexico region, and obviously the people that I'm just about to name wouldn't ever be put on this ballot in that region. But in terms of foreigners that have gone to Mexico, for fans my age, we think of the run that Hiromu had with Dragon Lee and CMLL. Obviously, prior to last month, Chris Jericho's time in Mexico was incredibly well thought of. But is Hamada the most successful foreigner you've seen step foot in Mexico?
I can't think of anyone who has been more integral to the promotion while they're there. I think what we get a lot is, like, Hiromu was the best case of one type, who was just a guy passing through for 6 to 18 months, having a lot of excellent matches, but it's never like, he's always like a B story to the A story that's going on. The promotion never was built around Hiromu and Dragon Lee. It was pushed up a bit because those guys were having such great matches, but that was not the day in, day out main story of the promotion ever. Jericho was more a guy who got into the top mix, but there were other bigger stars at that time, and he was not. If Jericho helped, but that was also a promotion that was not really drawing that well when he was there, and would not have made a huge difference if Jericho was never there. As much as they like him and as much as they like being there, I think Hamada makes a measurable difference to the early success of the UWA. And like, if the UWA in 1989 realizes, oh yeah, we need to figure out something else because this TV thing's going to eventually happen, we need to be ready for it and maneuver to start talking Televisa, and they find a way to continue on at some level to today, the Gran Hamada is remembered as an institution of the promotion and celebrated in a similar way to CML New Japan celebrating Black Cat at Fantastic Media every year, except to probably a much higher level, because it would also be that connective tissue between Japan and Mexico. But he's hurt because the promotion that should exist to celebrate him does not exist at all.
Yeah. One of the things I complain about on the show a lot is that when I watch young American wrestlers, it's very clear that they're not watching anything of substance on tape, and if they are, they're not translating into their work very easily. Are there contemporary luchadors that cite Hamada as any sort of influence?
No, unfortunately. I think the problem with, I don't want to throw all conventional or all current luchadors in the same bucket, but a lot of them are just watching a lot of WWE or a lot of, not even watching full shows. It's very much let's watch some clips on Instagram, let's watch some clips on TikTok, let's watch a gif of whatever Will Ospreay move happen. There's not a lot of digging deep into the past or even digging much at all, unfortunately.
Is there a smart culture there? Like, are there in an alternate universe? Are there Spanish speaking podcasts that are like, let's rewatch the UWA? This weird guy from California, Roy Lucier, has uploaded all of this TV. We're gonna rewatch it and talk about it. Or does that not really exist in that culture?
That it really has not existed that much. I think it's a culture where like the smart fans smart fans are people who are watching international wrestling, who are watching WB or watching New Japan at one point, that they're not digging into their own history as much in Mexico. Some of it's because it's just a lot easier to find stuff on, for like you could just turn on Peacock or New Japan World to find that stuff, and the CML stuff, or the UWA stuff or AAA stuff is around, but it's not as easily accessible. But even just like the basic watch this week's TV and talk about podcasts really does not exist in Mexico as it might in other places.
That's really odd. That's very interesting. We'll talk about influence here in just a second. You'll hear much more of Mike and much less of me, which I'm sure people are looking forward to. But Cubs, I don't know your opinion on this. We're going to transition sort of into Universal Lucha Libre, which was his promotion in Japan. Do you have broad thoughts on Universal? Is this stuff you've spent time with and that you've watched? When I mentioned Hamada's time as a promoter in Japan, what do you think of?
Yeah, it's not something I've spent a lot of time on, watched or studied. I've seen bits and pieces here. I do wonder if, like, the same discussion we were having, like how Hamada being in both places might have hurt him trying to promote Japan and have a career in Mexico. But I also think that I wonder if part of the Universal plan was, I'm going to be able to get all these stars from the UWA as they keep creating them over time, and be the first person to bring them to Japan, and then the UWA falling apart or going through a rapid decline as he's trying to get this thing up in Japan means his pipeline to the guys he thinks he's going to have gets cut off as people get moved to other promotions, or they just don't develop the stars that he's hoping for. That the two things kind of impacted each other at some level.
Here's the comp I make for anybody that's never seen Universal Lucha Libre. It is in so many ways the predecessor to Dragon Gate USA. If you watch the first year of Universal, it's Hamada and it's Perro and it's Yoshinari Asai, and it is this loaded roster of not only big stars in Mexico at the time, but the pageantry of it is mirroring what you would see in modern day Fantasticomanias just done in 1990. And then Yoshinari Asai leaves in 1991. He becomes Ultimo Dragon, so he signs with EMLL, which, as we talked about in January when we did the show on the formation of Torimon, that EMLL contract made him the highest paid foreign wrestler ever. It was a larger contract than what WCW gave Muda at the time. So he becomes a big star there. He signs with SWS, which pissed off all the Japanese smarks, because SWS was the promotion where good work went to die. It was a little bit like the predecessor to MLW, where it was like, oh, this should be an awesome match. I like these wrestlers. Wait a minute. It happened at SWS. It's not going to be anywhere near as good as it was. And once Asai leaves Universal, Hamada is not a big enough star to carry the weight of that loss. None of the guys that would go on to form Michinoku are developed enough or have those characters down enough to where they can really lead the promotion. There was never a follow-up to Asai. Now, part of that was, he was essentially stolen in the middle of the night. He was supposed to be on a November Universal Lucha Libre tour, but instead he ends up in Mexico for EMLL, where he debuts, and then ends up working SWS. They never have a chance to make somebody out of him because he leaves as quickly as they do. And then they peter out. And, I happen to think the in-ring of this promotion is incredibly strong from beginning to end. There's a lot of late-stage Universal stuff that I like. But in 1990 and 1991, they're performing in front of sold-out Korakuen crowds, of 1850, and everybody is biting onto every single move. It's an incredible atmosphere. And by 93, you can tell Korakuen's not sold out. The atmosphere isn't there. And it's a lot like Dragon Gate USA, where you just see this steep decline year after year, and it's a real bummer, but it is, to me, one of the most influential promotions of modern wrestling history. And this is where I'll primarily turn things over to Mike, and Cubs, by all means, feel free to jump in when you feel like it. But Mike, just in a broad sense, Universal Lucha Libre, explain the path that this promotion paved.
So I think that you have this big kind of issue that happens with the original UWF, that Hamada sticks out like a sore thumb. He goes back over after that All Japan year where, I mean, where like his one match with Mighty Inoue versus the Guerrero brothers is the only thing that makes tape, and he does not fit in Universal and in newborn Universal. So instead he launches this Lucha Libre promotion with the Shinma family as well. And the way that I choose to look at this, and I look at Gran Hamada just in general, and I feel kind of bad just because of the context that it's all kind of happening. But if you want to talk about like the Lucharesque bloodline in a way, it starts off with that, and you have this like 7 native wrestler core that comes from a lot of different places that kind of forms all together. Of course, Asai then goes off to EMLL, and then Ultimo Dragon is born. But you look at, I think, a lot of the core that would, of course, become members of Kaintai Deluxe and Michinoku Pro, but also you have figures like Gedo and Jado came through there. Of course, they don't stick around. They go over back to like FMW and they go down that route. But when you're looking at least the native roster that comes from Universal Lucha Libre, and I think you kind of see like these camps kind of coming together, because you have people like Sasuke and Asai who were New Japan wrestlers initially ending up in this group. And of course, the whole thing with Hamada being claimed to be too small for New Japan, so they ship him off to Mexico. And you see kind of and one of the guys that he's able to get over from New Japan, the person that would later kind of replicate his journey in a lot of ways in Asai. But I think really it's kind of like I don't want to say like a preparatory school kind of feeling I have for a lot of the wrestlers that came from Universal, but no one basically they've left whatever they did in Universal, then you would see very quickly Michinoku Pro in 93 and 94, Kaintai Deluxe, Great Sasuke, and all the Great Delphin and all the others. And it's something where, at least for me, it's this kind of root structure that from like those guys you see Michinoku Pro, that becomes Osaka Pro, and then Asai re-enters the picture with Torimon, and before you know it, you kind of have a full bloodline family tree emerging on the screen of how this one promotion just from that in 1990, 35 years later, you see basically the entire, at least one side of what would be considered independent Japanese wrestling is solely from the Universal part, I would say.
He's the godfather, he's the guy that went from Japan to Mexico, and Michinoku Pro and Torimon, and to some degree Hayabusa's career, all followed that same path, and you see where we are today. I will run down in just a second the list of Japanese wrestlers that credit Hamada as a trainer, but Cubs, I have to ask you, because I don't know, was Hamada credited with training wrestlers in Mexico at any point?
I could not find any record of people claiming him as a trainer. UWA had a lot of people working as trainers, and it was spread out. So it's possible they were just on a list of multiple people, but the only people I really saw specifically list him were his daughters, but none of the other wrestlers.
Okay, interesting. So in Japan for Universal, and the way I look at influence in terms of the Hall of Fame, because everybody has this discussion every year, but I'll do it quickly. We all fixate on drawing because it's concrete, it's very objective. There's a reason I asked the question about Hamada drawing X number of 10,000 person houses, because that for whatever reason carries more weight than I think maybe it should, or at least it carries a lot of weight within this voting pool. influence, Hamada's an interesting case where there is a purely in-ring influence that we'll discuss here momentarily, because it's easy to forget this was a guy that was a contemporary of Tatsumi Fujinami and began wrestling before Yoshiaki Fujiwara did, and yet he did all of the things that he did. So you have an in-ring component too. But in the same way that when Ultimo got voted in 2004, if you read what Dave writes about him in that year's Observer, he credits the early success of his Toryumon students as being influential and being a part of his candidacy. And, this was 2004. So the thought process there, they had just split from Ultimo, and Dave is basically like, well, we'll see what happens to these kids, but at least they had a pretty impressive 5 years. And in the same way that we attribute a lot of the early Dragon Gate stars, the first few generations of that dojo, Tozawa, Shingo, BB Hulk, Yamato, etc., and then obviously all the foreign talent, Ricochet, Young Bucks, etc., with CIMA, and that's one of the reasons I think CIMA deserves to be in this Hall of Fame. I think you have to credit Hamada with that same type of influence as a trainer. And Mike, correct me if I forget any names here.
Okay.
But of the names he trained, it includes Dick Togo, Gato, Jado, Great Sasuke, Jinsei Shinzaki, Kaz Hayashi, Min's Teioh, Super Delphin, Taka Michinoku, and of course, Yoshinari Asai. That is an incredible group of names where you have Asai, who is a Hall of Famer, you have Sasuke, who should be a Hall of Famer, and even if, let's say Hamada training Gato didn't lead him to being the Booker of New Japan, you still look at that list. Those are some of the more influential names in wrestling over the last 20 years.
Yeah, and I would say if you're looking at what developed to be the framework of at least Japanese pro wrestling, that's based outside of the traditional All Japan, New Japan framework and the promotions that came from that, you look up and down this list, and at least when you're looking at least the men's sides of Japanese pro wrestling, you don't necessarily have like Shanshiro Takagi or the deathmatch side, but that's basically the last 30 years of like promoters. I mean, you have Sasuke and I know Shinzaki is not listed on this list, but they end up doing Michinoku Pro. Delphin starts up Osaka Pro, does Sifu Pro Wrestling, and is now doing 2.5. And then, of course, Taka Michinoku through Kaintai Dojo, and then later Just Tap Out. Like, you start to see a framework of pro wrestling that kind of develops with these like students in a lot of ways. And the wild thing that I didn't mention earlier, Case, is that you have Gato, Jado, and Super Delphin who actually start their wrestling career way before Universal is a thing, because they're part of Takeshi Pro Wrestling Gundam, who was the stand-up comedian who brought in Vader for the riot that happened in Sumo Hall. They were the wrestlers who were in the dojo training by this comedian. So you have like this ability that he was able to kind of pull all these guys into it. And then after the time period Universal Lucha Libre, I think really, if you don't have what comes from Universal, you don't have the wrestling that we now know today. I mean, just look at the promotions that those 9 people are responsible for.
Yeah, look, this is going to be a blanket statement, and feel free to disagree with me, but if there's no Hamada, if he doesn't exist, Japanese junior heavyweight still exists, and I think everybody becomes a Tatsumi Fujinami clone, which would have been a great thing. Fujinami is one of the 5 greatest wrestlers of all time.
Or Sayama.
Or Sayama, you're right. But there is an entire style and an entire culture of Japanese wrestling that exists because of Hamada. Do you think that's a fair statement?
Oh, I think so. And I would even, and I don't know if we want to get like too theoretical about influence, Case, I would even say that extends to mass North American pro wrestling as well.
Please explain.
Because I think if we're talking about the ring style, that, I mean, you watch Universal or like 93, 94 Michinoku Pro, and I know that these days 10-man is always like pointed to as this early high watermark in this wrestling style. And of course, Gran Hamada is a part of that. But you take that from where that was in 1996, and you see how the pro wrestling styles have evolved, and essentially you take it you take it almost 30 years later, 28 years later to 2024, and you see the style that came from it. It's not the wrestling that you see that's on more so AEW, but I would argue that there's influences there in WWE, like the house style is more representative of what you would see from that these days 6-man, which comes from the universal style more so than I would say anything else that was happening in Japanese pro wrestling in 1996.
I think he created a culture and an in-ring style, and I think, and not to entirely ruffle any feathers, but the difference between him and say Yoshiaki Fujiwara on the Japan side is that it's still to this day a relevant and vibrant style, and I think it's fair, and maybe not everybody does, I think it's fair to draw a line between Hamada's influence and modern day Dragon Gate. And even if, you remain unmoved by their 2024 business, that has to include 2013 through 2016, which was a time period that by that point still had far outlasted shoot style promotion relevance in Japan. And I think that really matters. In terms of what you said of the in-ring Cubs, I'll ask you this, because I think one of the more famous Hamada matches, just because of the circulation of it, is that April 30th, 1980 UWA match. It's Hamada and Sayama against Babyface and Perro Aguayo. If you just cloned that version of 1980 Gran Hamada and put him on American TV today, don't you think he would fit in with what he was doing in the ring?
Yeah, I think everyone in that match felt like they could still do that match today and still stand out. Sayama most of all because of his athleticism. But I think what Hamada was able to, his cleanness of his technique and his speed and his movement would have carried through if he was a wrestler coming through today.
Yeah,
for sure.
I think that's really the beauty of Hamada. And, I'm somebody who was a little bit late to this. Mike had sent me some Universal Lucha footage years ago that I didn't dive into. And, I recalled, Dylan Hales talking about how Hamada was so much better than Shima, and I kind of blew it off. And this was, a decade ago. And, even Alan and Mike were like, no, you really got to watch Hamada stuff. And I just didn't for whatever reason. And then I finally, when I dove in about 5 years ago to a lot of the footage that's out there, it's just amazing to me. It's a little bit of the argument I make with Dragon Gate now, where all of wrestling is doing Dragon Gate, and it's not making wrestling better because they're doing shitty Dragon Gate more often than not. And, the footwork and the timing and the natural athleticism of Hamada, the way that he could do a comeback where, he would just fall from one move into the next, and it would all look so natural. Nobody was ever standing around. He would just bounce and bounce and bounce. And then all of a sudden you have this white hot babyface comeback. It's the kind of thing where not only do I think it would fit in on TV in 2024, I think it would blow people away. And I'll continue to reemphasize this because I think it's relevant. He started training before Yoshiaki Fujiwara, which is just to paint a picture of how long ago he was doing what can be looked at as a contemporary junior heavyweight style. And Mike, I think that is absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and I think when you you use a term like influence, we touched a little bit, or Cubs touched a little bit on his daughters. Like he had his own kind of like tenure that he had, like that he was a women's trainer as well, to my knowledge, like in JWP. Like I remember, at least in like my research before this episode, all of the talk about how he was refereeing and he did this, and then the match with Blue Panther, it's using old JWP ring skirts and all of that. So you have like his relationship like through that as well, that I think is kind of interesting. But it's when you look at, and I think like the core of how relevant he is and the style he created, I think you just like look at like what ends up happening in in major American pro wrestling. And I think like the comparison to Fujiwara, like the fact that essentially kind of enter a little bit like he enters before Fujiwara and all of this, and the way it splits, like there's such like a stronger through line to me, at least in the style of wrestling. And I think a lot of that is because of the stuff that, you know, Will Ospreay, the Young Bucks, whatever, that they've consumed and that they've kind of adapted and learned from. And it's so much closer to like this Michinoku Pro stuff, or even the Universal Lucha Libre, I feel like.
And I think it's important to note, adapted, consumed, and made money from this style of wrestling. You know, they have become major stars and trendsetters as a result of, again, adapting and consuming. I think those are the perfect words to use there. Something that Hamada laid the groundwork for. So I think that's really important. There's an argument to be made, and I certainly would not be the one to make this argument, but there's an argument to be made that peak Michinoku Pro, so, you know, 96 is pretty much a perfect year of wrestling, you know, but, you know, if you want to go 94 through 97 is kind of where I mark that Gran Hamada is in all of these great matches, but he's in these great matches at the time where Sasuke is doing the best work of his career, and Dick Togo is arguably doing the best work of his career, and Taka is unbelievable, and Masato Yakishiji's there. Mike, I'll start with you. Cubs, if you have thoughts on this, please weigh in after Mike. Do you think Hamada is a vital and integral part to some of these legacy-defining Michinoku Pro matches, or is he the sixth guy in the six-man tag, the eighth guy in the eight-man tag, the 10th guy in the 10-man tag?
You know, I think that if you look at the These Days match, and then also in 1996, the Star Lanes, and even, you know, getting into 1997 with the Nanawa unmasking match in January, the thing that you kind of get from Hamada is that he is just as an important piece of these matches. And in the case of the Star Lanes match, the entire finishing stretch is solely about Hamada at that point. That like he has his kind of role. Like the thing that I've really enjoyed whenever I get into Michinoku Pro is the way that they kind of have this ever-changing Seki gun that will go from like, okay, we're going to have Tiger Mask 4 in here this time. No, we're going to take out Tiger Mask 4, and then we're going to put in Sasuke instead. And it's like, all right, we're going to drop 2 of them. But this time,
and
this is going to be about
thank
Nanawa.
God they got rid of Tiger Mask 4.
Right, yeah.
This match is going to be better now.
But the thing is that they never take out Nanawa, they never take out Delphin, and they never take out Hamada, because all 3 of them have very essential roles, I would argue, throughout these Michinoku Pro matches. And it's one of those things that the more you kind of rewatch the Kaintai Deluxe kind of run, the more you could kind of appreciate like how they were able to like go like, okay, Hamada gets like a lot of the calls. It's usually him or Delphin as the most popular guys in these matches. And it's just their ability of like, okay, this time let's focus in on unmasking and bloodying Grand Nanawa. That's what we're going to do for it here. And it always pays off, I feel like. And I feel like, yeah, no, Hamada is just as essential in those matches as Sasuke to me.
Cubs, do you have any thoughts on... Oh, go ahead.
I would agree. I think even more than the work, it's like watching some of those matches that back last night. It struck me how much of like the Kaintai style was just lifted from Mexican Lucha Libre spots that they were doing, perhaps like faster or a little bit more intense. But you could see Hamada's influence in how the match was laid out, how some of the creativity of some of the ideas had to come from someone who had spent a lot of time in Mexico and understood how to adapt that to a Japanese ring. And I'm sure, like, I don't want to discredit the work that the Rudos had done in the match, but it was so. It felt like he was bringing a lot of what he had done in UWA to a promotion or a country that had not seen as much of it, and so some of these ideas that he had seen for a decade were fresh to people who had not seen them, and that was a big strength of those matches.
Okay, Cubs, I'm so glad you brought that up. I have been meaning to ask you this. So in Japan, right, you know, like you said, you know, I think Kaientai is the start of this heel faction, this attitude, this in-ring style that then gets handed off to Crazy Max, which then gets handed off to Blood Generation. And then there's a few years there in Dragon Gate where I don't really think that style is represented, but then it kind of comes back in Blood Warriors. And sadly, even though obviously, guilty, I love the modern day Dragon Gate product. I don't feel that with Z-Brats. I didn't feel that with RED. It wasn't there in Berserk or really most of Mad Blanky. Can you explain what you just said of, what was the stuff that predated Kaientai in Mexico? Or who are the groups that I should look out for as, I guess for lack of a better term in this conversation, doing proto-Kaientai stuff in Mexico?
Well, it's hard to say exactly, because it would be the different UWA trios that would kind of push you towards, like the Terminarios, Black Terry, Jose Luis Feliciano, and Chuel Guerrero. And they come to mind because they always face the Arquero the Espacio, and with Usija was wearing an Arquero outfit for all his matches and never could understand why. But what else? Like the Brazos. I'm struggling to think of themes, but it's like the default Rudo act in Mexico. When I see them doing the Cartera, the two guys hold opponent with an armbar on each side, and someone stands in the middle and poses. That's such a classic heel spot in Mexico that does not exist anyplace else until people like Gran Hamada start pulling it to Japan and pulling it to maybe to the U.S. for what extent it gets to the U.S. It just feels like the 80s, early 90s kind of bumping a lot for the Rudos, stooging a bit to make them look better kind of style that a lot of people were.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, is it a fair assessment to say that, like, I don't know, I watch a lot of Glate, unfortunately, and you can
sorry, that's my doing,
and you can tell in some of these Glate matches, even if he's not in the match, you go, oh, that is directly Shima's influence. That is a Shima spot. That is a Shima thing. For these high-end Michinoku Pro matches, in 96 in particular, when Hamada's there, can you attribute a lot of that style to Hamada taking this thing over from Mexico and freshening it up in Japan?
I think that's the origin of it. I think as time went on and the matches evolved, that you could see more of the Japanese style kind of come into it, or like more into something a little more traditional to Japanese wrestling. But you can see that the basis of it were ideas that they were taking from Mexico.
Interesting. Mike, I want to go back to you here and talk about Hamada as the booker. I think, and maybe this is just representative of, something that you and I talk about a lot, and something that Rich and Joe talks about a lot, and Cubs, because he's smart and avoids a lot of discourse, doesn't necessarily participate in these conversations because, again, he's smarter than all of us. But there's a lack of, the term that's been used is talking ball lately. And there's a lot of people that even are participating in the Hall of Fame discussions that sometimes I scratch my head and go like, oh, that's okay. That's not my perspective, but more power to you, whatever. I think right now, the current crop of either voters in this Hall of Fame or just the most active participants are doing a thing where they are racking up all of the positives that these wrestlers had, and they are not weighing them against the negatives. They are simply saying, look at all the good they contributed, therefore they are a Hall of Famer, and they're ignoring some of the more negative aspects of their career. So I have two questions in relation to some perhaps negative Hamada things. One, I want to talk about him as a booker. Again, Yoshinari Asai was such a star in Universal and was the sole draw of that promotion. When he leaves in 91, there's direct correlation to the promotion, slowly going under at that point. Do you look at it as an overwhelming negative for Hamada, both as a performer and as a booker, that he wasn't able to keep that promotion afloat for longer?
I think that, the Asai not being able to have like a 1A to kind of push back out there. I guess it would be MASA Michinoku, technically, would be the number 2 out of that, the future great Sasuke. But it's something that I kind of you, I, I think when we talk about Universal Lucha Libre, we also have to talk about the world at large at that time. And that was a time where a lot of promotions were going bust really quickly with like outside money, because outside money dried up because the Japanese economy inverted basically at like that time period. And that's been a struggle of the Japanese economy for the greater part of the last 30 years. Like they called it originally a lost decade, and then they added an S to it because it still kept on going. It was the last bank to still have like a negative interest rate, like up until like last like 3 months ago. So I think that there are other things that hurt Hamada purely as a booker, but I mean, I think the fact that your students immediately go and create a much more successful promotion that outlasts, and then it is hyper regionalized, and that helps the promotion probably last past that Kaientai peak, like past in 97 and 98. But you have to though like acknowledge though that the fact that at that time, and it's not like that Lucha Libre was absent in Japan. Of course, Mil Mascaras was around during the JWA days. So at that time, you could say, oh, he did not recognize his market. He did not. He was not able to adapt to it. Not able to kind of get the funding from to make it get them through 93. But at a certain point, I think that it's going to be like one of the negative marks for him. But it's such like kind of an abstract thing, because you're looking at him more or less than as like one facet of his game. Maybe I would say like I think the rest of Hamada's candidacy and the rest of his wrestling life is so strong that it's such an overwhelming case to me that I would not ding him that far for bad booking. I mean, you look at the style promotion that Universal, Michinoku Pro, Osaka Pro, and really what the one out of those promotions that started to survive and exist for longer than like a 5-period hot stretch became Toryumon, because Toryumon realized that they had to constantly cycle new names in and have a wrestling school that was able to constantly have new faces, and that kind of turns out to be the way to solve the Lucha promotion bubble, I guess, or the
Ultimo
problem.
solved. He learned from the history of what happens when he left a promotion.
Right.
And
Yeah.
said,
No, exactly.
we're not going to do that. Okay. Second question. And I was asked this about Shima last year, and I pushed back on this pretty strongly. I think this talking point that Shima doesn't have this litany of great singles matches is really overrated. And as you and I have done some Toryumon related shows this year, I feel even stronger about that now. But the three of us on this call have watched a lot of Gran Hamada matches, and we'll start with Mike and then go to Cubs on this. Are you bothered by the fact that at least on tape, because there's an entire 70s run that we don't have, there doesn't seem to be the definitive legendary Gran Hamada singles match?
I think when you look into like Mexico and like the wrestling style in Mexico, like unless we got like the Rene Gallardo apuestas and things like that, it's going to be something that when you consider that category, that there's going to be less like high profile singles matches if you are of a certain era. I think Hamada has some really strong ones. I love Blue Panther from Universal Lucha Libre from 1990. And I think there are some other times that he has like those feuds with Babyface or Perro Aguayo where he has them. It's just, I think it's kind of the product of the environment in a lot of ways, whereas I felt like the Shima argument, there are the great Shima matches, is just personal taste at a certain.
Yeah, I think it's just bad luck more than saying anything about his abilities that we didn't get what we've got with Stingray Chicano versus MSA Uno because Arena Mexico just happened to be taped that week, and they happened to send that, or someone happened to bring a recorder into the building. I think I feel safe that if those matches I've ever turned up equivalent UWA matches, that they would be of great quality. But I think it's just more bad luck that the UWAs that he worked in a promotion where very few of his matches were taped, rather than a reflection of his ability.
I would agree with that, and I also, he's got a singles match with Min's Teioh in, I think it's mid '96, and it's a good match. It's a walk and brawl. It feels it's the part of Michinoku that feels Memphis adjacent of all things, and it's a fine match. But you almost sit and watch it and go, this feels out of place. I'm not watching Michinoku Pro for classic singles matches. Now there were there are a lot of singles matches, especially Sasuke in 94 and 95 that I just adore, but this was a guy who made his living A in Mexico, B in Michinoku Pro, and those were not environments that thrived on singles matches. And I also think wrestling should just change their mindset and embrace trios matches. United States wrestling and United States wrestling fans should embrace the trios match as something that has main event potential, but I don't know if we'll ever get to that point. That's a separate argument. I want to talk about matches with Gran Hamada now. I think I've got a list here. There's going to be 10 matches in the description and in the Open the Voice Gate channel on the Voices of Wrestling Discord of the Hamada matches that if you've never seen any, or if you want to check some out, that I would highly recommend. Cubs, I'll start with you, and then go to Mike. Do you have a go-to Hamada match? Do you have a favorite match, a definitive match when it comes to Hamada?
I would say that it's the UWA match that ended up on New Japan TV, that Sayama and Hamada versus Babyface and Perro Aguayo match, just because because the work in the match is really great, and to look into a promotion at a time that we don't have that many great looks, it's filmed beautifully, and even though that the ending is like the build to the next week, it's not a definite ending. It is one where you can see the high level that everyone's working in the match that was not even like the biggest match.
Can you explain to me the story? Because I don't know if it's related to that match, but you've tweeted about it before. There's a story in that Inoue, if I have it right, Inoue ordered Hamada to work an EMLL show so that EMLL would send Sayama to work a UWA show. What are the details behind that? Because I might be totally wrong.
What happened was when New Japan was sending Sayama to Mexico, I think EML, seeing the success that UWA had with Hamada, got Sayama for themselves. So he was only working at Arena Mexico shows, and at that point, UWA and EML were not hating each other. They would, like, once in a great while, they would send talent to the other shows, but they weren't really working together greatly. So near the end of 1979, I have the date here, December 7th, 1979, Hamada works his first his first EML show in about 3 years. He is the current UWA light heavyweight champion, and he puts over the EML equivalent, Alfonso Dantes, who is the NWA light heavyweight champion, with just the NWA title on the line. The deal is that in Rio, about 2 weeks later, they have a Mexico versus the World show, and I assume that show was probably paid for New Japan TV or for World Pro Wrestling or wherever the show is, and that's why Inoue wanted Sayama to be able to work on that show so they could show how he's doing in Mexico. So Inoue, who holds a lot of power with UWA because he's the guy getting them the foreigners at the point, convinces UWA to send Hamada over, have him do a big favor for EML so they can get Sayama to come over to their promotion for one match. And it's really just like a mid-card tag match. So I think he just wanted to see him on that show and be able to have film of him at that point. It's really, though, it's Inoue has getting those working together pays off for both promotions next year, because that's when Andre comes to the Mexico first time, and Inoue gets them both to use him, and they both make so much money working together that they start becoming like firmly working together promotions from that point on.
Okay, cool. Wow. Hamada. We'll credit Hamada with some of those Andre houses then, I guess.
Yeah.
Mike, your go-to, hey, this is why Gran Hamada is so great match, because obviously in-ring work is a part of the Observer Hall of Fame, and I think I don't know if influence or I don't know which is the strongest of his categories, but you and I especially rank him very, very highly in the Greatest Wrestler Ever project. What's your go-to Hamada match?
Yeah, this is the match I hammer all the time. I thoroughly love 12-16-96, the full 10-man tag Kaintai Deluxe versus Hamada, Nanawa, Delphin, Yakashiji, and Sasuke. It out of like I was talking a little bit earlier about the Seki Gun versus the Kaintai DX matches. This one, out of the ones that really get circulated, I feel like is more about Hamada. It's more his focus here. It's a lot of Hamada and Dick Togo kind of having just like a mean hoss off, and then after Hamada has like the closest near fall in the match, this crowd in Hakata Star Lanes is just on their feet for his Hurricane Rana, and then the closing stretch is just awesome there. And that's on top of the fact that I would also argue that if you're talking about Michinoku Pro, this is the best Yakashiji match as well.
It's the best Michinoku Pro match. I feel very strongly that match in Fukuoka, 12-16-96, that's the best one. I think the Battle Arts match from January 1997, so just a month later, is number 2. And then, and this is something that I can now fixate over for the next few days, I would maybe have the These Days match at number 3, but there's some stuff that in that summer of 96 that I think is it's definitely not as famous as the These Days match, but I think it's probably better. Like when Liger shows up and Liger does that, he does a 6-man. It's unbelievable how good it is.
The thing that gets me at like the These Days match is how young Nanawa is at that point. Like he was so young at like the height of kind of his fandom within Michinoku Pro, and he just it's one of those things you're like, oh wow, he was in his, when everyone else had like been around for a while and did other things. No, Nanawa was kind of the young pup of that promotional group, and I always thought that was kind of one of the things about the These Days match that kind of stuck out to me.
Well, luckily, both of the matches you guys referenced, I have in this match list here. A few others that I want to highlight really quick. One, we've referenced it a few times now. There's a match from September 1984 that is Hamada and Mighty Inoue versus Chavo Guerrero and Hector Guerrero. And I have combed over the All Japan 1984 TV listings multiple times to make sure that I am not missing anything. But to my knowledge, this is the only Hamada match that makes tape from his All Japan run. He looks, he was always billed at 5'6". He looks about 4 feet tall in this match. There's something about 1984 All Japan with Hansen and Brody and the Funks and Jumbo and Tenryu and Baba that when you put Hamada in this ring, he looks smaller than he ever did. But Hamada is unbelievable in this match. And, we talk about the lost treasure trove of the 70s footage, but just to have a handful more of 84 All Japan Hamada feels like it's a holy grail out there. And I don't think it'll ever surface. It's a real bummer.
Yeah, it's also really remarkable for him, like in this year that he is in All Japan, how over he is in this match.
Well, yeah, I mean, think about, like, again, he's on the same cards as Dory Funk Jr., and unless you're going to be completely close-minded to what Hamada does because of his size, it would be mind-blowing, because I really do think Hamada approached his style of wrestling, and maybe it's the New Japan Dojo background and the fact that, he actually started training with Inoki during the JWA, which, again, just goes to contextualize his bizarre career, but I always felt like Hamada approached his high-flying and his high-speed stuff with some air of legitimacy, and it weirdly works in All Japan. Now, I don't know if it would have worked in a 6-man with Jumbo, but I know against the Guerreros on an All Japan card, it certainly worked.
Yeah, and I think that you get to see like a level of confidence for Hamada at this. I mean, the crowd is already with him, and with like the Guerreros, he's able to really show off like the kind of wrestling that he developed in UWA. Like, imagine trying to go to like Resher Kimura and be like, all right, I'm going to do my my stalling headlock takeover on you, and I need you to basically support my weight for this. Like, imagine like pitching that to some people of that generation who were around at that time. So like it really is like a scenario where I feel like in this match, like I'm glad this one made tape, because I wonder what those other matches would have been for his tenure there.
Yeah, it's a real bummer we don't have those. There's a match from 1990 in Cubs. I put this in our Twitter DM thread in case you don't know what match I'm referring to, but there's a 6-man tag that is Hamada, Santo, and Yoshinari Asai versus Blue Panther, Fuerza, Guerrera, and Negro Casas from 1990. And even though I am continuing to educate myself more on Lucha, I'm watching more Lucha than ever, I'm enjoying more Lucha than ever, there will never be a match that defeats this combination of guys for me. It is the perfect 6-man tag. It's listed on YouTube as being from WWA in 1990. There's no month, there's no date. Do you know anything about this show?
No, I know it's WWA would have been a Tijuana promotion, and having accurate information about Tijuana promotions can be tough. I mean, it's not as bad as the WWO that would come later that would have these mysterious tapings with random Americans, but it's not. I can tell it's a bigger arena, but it's not the Auditorio Tijuana where most of the stuff is taped. But I was not able to immediately remember where this was taped from.
Yeah, it seems to be like I think there's a trios tournament on that show, and it seems to be a pretty loaded lineup, but there's not really a ton of info out there. I just know that there's this match, and again, for 1990, I mean, Santo's got both of his knees at this point. Panther's moving around. Fuerza, when he was on, to me, is just the perfect wrestler, and you've got Hamada in there just ripping things up. So that is a highly recommended match. That's on YouTube. Mike referenced this Blue Panther match earlier, and when Danielson was preparing to wrestle Blue Panther, I linked this on my Twitter, and I would feel foolish sitting on this call with the Cubs fan pretending I know a lot about Blue Panther, but I do know that I love this match because one of the weird things with all of the Universal Lucha Libre footage, and again, this was way more available before archive.org got shut down, and I unfortunately don't know if we'll ever see some of this footage again. It was the Korkins would be on TV, maybe a Nagoya or an Osaka would air every once in a while, but for whatever reason, there were just a ton of handhelds that exist from this promotion, and this Hamada Blue Panther match is one of those. It's a handheld shot from the crowd, and these guys go out there on a house show and work this half-hour match that, it's, I guess, a little akin to maybe what Sabre and Hechicero did this year, but it certainly feels like it's shockingly stiff. You can tell it is a match that is taking place in Japan. Then they do all of this tricked-out lucha grappling, and this might be the best Hamada singles match that we have. I know, Mike, you love it as well.
Yeah, it's just like I'm someone that gets kind of cranky sometimes about the various technical styles of Lucha Libre, or people that are claiming are technical styles of it or submission styles of this. Instead, you get to see this. It starts off like brawling around the arena, like they do like full brawls into it, and then by the end of the match, it's trading like hold for hold. And I think that Hechicero and Zack Sabre Jr. comp is pretty apt. It was in Gunma Prefectural Sports Center, an arena that I don't think ever was taped outside of this one handheld.
I certainly don't recognize it.
Oh no! It's the town name is Maebashi, which I never heard of until I started looking into it.
Interesting. I've got 2 more matches I want to highlight here. Again, there will be a list of 10 matches that will go along with this podcast that I recommend everybody check out. But I've pimped this match for a few years now. This was one of my great discoveries, either during Greatest Wrestler Ever or just shortly after, when I was really combing through a lot of the Universal Lucha Libre footage. And there's, Asai is the star of Universal, and when you go back and watch 1990 and 1991 Yoshinari Asai, it all makes sense why he was as coveted as he was. And I think we've become so complacent and just so used to old man lazy doesn't want to bump Ultimo Dragon that we forget the type of wrestler that he was before the arm injury, and especially the wrestler that he was before he ever had the Ultimo character. But there's so much good Hamada out there. There's a Viano 4 match that I really enjoy. There's a Hamada and Bulldog KT singles match, which Bulldog KT was Gato. And it is one of those funny things where that was a 1993 singles match. If you watch that match in the context of 2024, it makes modern day New Japan make so much sense because Gato is doing an American heel act in Universal Lucha Libre against Hamada, and it works because Hamada's such a great babyface, he's able to play off of it, but it's like, oh my God, Gato's influences are just bursting at the seams here. Like, everything about him makes so much more sense now. But to me, the crown jewel of this footage is this match from November 14th, 1991. This would have been right as Asai was leaving. I think he worked maybe the show before this, or maybe this was his last show. But this is Hamada, MASA Michinoku, which would be the Great Sasuke, and Monkey Magic Wakita, which would be Super Delphin, against Dr. Wagner Jr., El Texano, and Silver King. I look at this match as the first truly great Lucharesu trios match. This is a match that would have fit in Michinoku, would have fit in Toriumon, would have fit in Dragon Gate. It is, I think, detached enough from any of the Hamada UWA footage that we have where it's like, oh, that is proper, pure Lucha Libre. This has a little bit of the Japanese influence on it, and part of that, and this isn't necessarily anything to do with Hamada, but Cubs, I want to throw this at you. Texano and Silver King, as a tag team and as a trio, I think were so far ahead of their time, and I always wonder if they would have come along 10 years later and ended up in either Toriumon, which is the obvious comparison, or even like the early Noah Juniors division, just what their reputation would be today, because they work so fast and so stiff, and much like Hamada, it all would work in 2024, I feel.
Yeah, they are so well coordinated in that match, and also I think on that list is a match from UWA from 1992, where you can just see that they're a team that has, they know what they're doing before they're even doing it.
Mm-hmm.
They know where the other person's going to be, and they're just like of one mind. They're just like a great tag unit that I think, like Hamada, I think they would work today. I think they're unfortunate because their timing, they came along a little bit too late in UWA, and they weren't quite as late enough to make a impression someplace else, but they are so smooth together that it's amazing. Am I remembering right that they were in WCW in that tag team tournament around here, and they would have been like WCW early 90s would have no idea what to do with.
Correct. That is entirely correct. Is they're there and it's not as memorable as you'd like it to be.
No, because they have no idea what to make of those guys. They are so ahead of where they are. Like they are like wrestling in the Nitro era compared to the rest of the promotion. But and then Silver King would be back then. But they're just they're a fine oiled machine as a team. It sticks out how strong they are at the partnership.
They remind me a little bit. It's like a tag team of the best versions of Sua that we ever got, where they're just kind of brick shit houses, but they're weirdly athletic and they're super fast and they're incredibly coordinated. And it's like, oh man, I wish these guys would have just come across 10 years later, because I think they would have fit in with that wrestling world so much better. This might be a dumb question, because again, there's a reason I don't vote Mexico, despite all the lucha that I'm trying to consume right now. I know Texano was in the Hall of Fame in his trios, Misioneros de la Muerte, but were Texano and Silver King as a tag team, were they ever a draw? Were they looked at as stars? I don't know anything about the background of that team. I just know that together they kicked ass.
I think they were looked at as being incredible workers, but I don't think they were pushed at a level where they would have got to be draws. It's a weird quirk of Mexican wrestling that 2 versus 2 team matches really did not become a huge thing that you put on the top until like the 90s. Actually, Hamada is kind of partially responsible for this, because the UWA, at one point in the 1950s, they tried to make a national tag team title, and for whatever reason, the commission said, no, we're not going to do that. So there wasn't really any team titles until like the 80s. UWA decides that, okay, we're going to have a tournament to crown our promotional tag team titles, so the commission can't really do anything about it. And they crown Gran Hamada and Riki Choshu. But then Choshu jumps to All Japan, so they have a person who's no longer working with their promotional partner as tag team champion. And the tag team division just kind of goes on hold for like 5-7 years. So had those tag team titles been around and had like the Cowboys had chances to win those titles and main event with those titles, maybe they'd be remembered differently. But also they could have just not made them vacant or put them on the shelf for 5 years and figured out something. But it's more like a quirk of history that they weren't given a bigger run.
I'm in the continuous theme of, oh man, I wish this Hamada era was on tape. There's only a few Choshu Hamada tags that we have record of, and we have no footage of them. I know there's one really cool photo of them kind of hunched together at ringside, and I think Choshu might be busted open in that photo. And it's just one of those like, oh my god, why can't I have a clipped version of this, a joint in progress version of this? Give me some sort of footage with those two, because they were both, I think, trailblazers in their own way, and they just happened to team in that weird period in Mexico, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah, there's so many gaps. That'd be nice if we had a time machine to go back and film in and some nice quality.
I completely agree. The last Hamada match that I want to mention, and then I'll get you guys out of here momentarily, but one of my big things for this podcast was, okay, we don't really have footage of him in the 70s. There's enough Hamada footage in the 80s, and there's at least at the very least there's the Hamada and Sayama tag that we've talked about, which is in 1980. So I know he has a great match in 1980 on tape. He has a litany of great matches between Universal and Michinoku Pro and UWA on tape, and some New Japan stuff I watched of him in the 1994 Super Junior tag tournament that I watched this week. That was fantastic. Like, he's got great 90s matches, but I was curious if we had on tape him having great matches in 3 different decades. I thought that would be an important component of his longevity case. And I watched a lot of Michinoku Pro from 2000 and 2001 and 2002, a lot of stuff that I have never seen before, because I really hadn't looked for this footage prior to this happening. There's an interesting Sasuke Hamada singles match from 2000 that is really slow and is a lot of leg work, and it's good, but I wanted it to be better. And after I watched that, I thought, man, that's probably the best shot he's got at a great match. Maybe there's just not any great Hamada matches in the 21st century. And then I stumbled upon March 10th, 2001, Dick Togo, Gran Hamada, and the Great Sasuke versus Apache, Pentagon, and Sasuke the Great. And let me tell you guys, this match fucking rocks. And Hamada is a big part of it. And so I mentioned this only for the sake of, I knew he had great matches in the 80s. I knew he had great matches in the 90s. And I had never seen this before. This was a great discovery for me. It's a big, heated Cork and Hall brawling style trios match, but Hamada holds up his end of the bargain. He and Pentagon in particular have really cool chemistry in this match. And so there is Hamada, a great match in the 21st century. I think that is worth noting as we close things out here. Cubs, I will start with you as we put a bow on the Hamada discussion. Is there anything that I missed, anything that you want to mention in terms of, hey, if you're voting in Mexico or you're thinking about voting in Mexico, here's why you should vote for Gran Hamada?
There was a 1979 match with Hamada in Mexico, but someone deleted the channel it was on, so that's very sad. We could have gone 4 decades there.
Oh, that really sucks.
I think what people need to know is that, I think the cross-country influence of someone who was bringing in some Japanese ideas to Mexico and Mexican ideas to Japan is pretty important. I don't think people who aren't watching Mexican wrestling close enough realize that how much of those ideas got spread to other countries, especially to Japan, and became influential in the wrestling. And Hamada is one of the primary guys responsible for setting up that and being this anchor in Mexico that could help the Japanese guys get started there, and brought the Mexican wrestlers back over to Japan. There were people with no masters before who went to Japan, so it's not like there was no connection between the countries. But he brought the faster moving style, the quick, the more modern UWA style as opposed to what Mascaras and others were doing before him. So I think there's a lot of shared history between those two countries, and I think Hamada plays a big role in it.
Mike, anything else you want to mention about Hamada?
Yeah, I think that if you are someone who really values, as Cubs was saying, like kind of the cross-pollination of wrestling, and like the idea that if you're someone who appreciates that, like in 2024, what at least the wrestling that's consumed by probably 60 to 70% of people is based off of a style that kind of, in its own way, like, of course, like we've talked about like Sayama and other people that were that were from Japan, that were stars in Mexico, and then going back to Japan and becoming large stars. But you look at the style that Hamada has and what it all went to. I mean, we're essentially talking about 45 years of wrestling history, if not earlier, if we want to go to that 70s match that Cubs mentioned. That really, I think you have that there's a real strong argument that the most representative person, if you want to talk about Godfather, as you were saying, Case, or just in general, like the progenitor of it, it starts with him. And until we started, until Case was like, all right, look up these guys and look at their influence, I really didn't recognize the fact of how much of wrestling outside of the two majors were based around things that came from Hamada. And even if you're just focusing in like certain areas and just looking at Mexico stuff, I think just from like what Cubs has said about UWA and his basis as like the drawing star from it, and like the main featured act in its important years, is like crucial for understanding that period of wrestling history. And I think, Case, like over the years we've talked a lot about like the Hall of Fame and like what the way I kind of look at these things, and I don't think you could tell the story of pro wrestling in 2024 without having Gran Hamada as someone you mentioned. So I if I were not blackballed / ballot, however you want to look at it, and if I voted in Mexico, he would be the first name I would put down instantly. I think he is a no doubter in my mind.
That's the way I look at the Hall of Fame, is ultimately, can you tell the story of pro wrestling without them? And Hamada, to me, look, I still, and I say this with my chest, I think Shima's the strongest candidate on the ballot, and I understand the way that his career's going. He's not going to get in. He had a window. The window's gone. It really sucks. I think the Bucks are number 2 on the ballot, and I think Hamada is number 3. And I really don't think you can tell the story of pro wrestling without Gran Hamada. And like I said earlier, yes, there's this wing of Japanese junior heavyweight wrestling that has and will forever be influenced by Tatsumi Fujinami. And, I think the Davey, Roddy, Eddie Edwards era of Ring of Honor, let's say, those are all direct descendants of a junior heavyweight style that was created by and large by Fujinami. And nobody would hesitate in saying Tatsumi Fujinami is a Wrestling Observer Newsletter Hall of Famer. Then you have this other wing that is Gran Hamada, and is this long-standing, long-influential, successful tree of junior heavyweight wrestling that starts with Hamada and goes to Asai and goes to Great Sasuke, and you get Michinoku Pro and Osaka Pro and Toriyama and Dragon Gate, and these have been relevant promotions, game-changing promotions, influential promotions in the modern wrestling world, and that literally all starts with Hamada. And so if the argument was just his influence, I would put him in on influence alone. But as Cubs so thoroughly and excellently explained, this guy was a star in Mexico, responsible, at least partially, for multiple 10,000 plus houses, and also I think he's one of the 50 greatest wrestlers ever. Now, I wouldn't put him in on in-ring work alone. I wouldn't put him in on drawing alone. But when you factor in those things, this is a guy who to me is just a slam dunk, no doubt Hall of Famer. If he was in Japan, I would vote for him. Sadly, he is in Mexico, and I leave that to people much smarter than me like Cubs. So Cubs, before we let you go, and thank you so much for your time. You've been so generous. Do you have any thoughts on Mexico this year? Luckily the conversation among that region, I think has by and large changed. There was the logjam for years. People in Mexico, they couldn't agree who to vote on, who they wanted to get in. I feel like that has gotten better. And now I'm just curious, as you look at the 2024 class of nominees, who sticks out to you?
Yeah, it's a 12-person list this year, and we can vote for 4 people. And about 10 of them I would probably actively consider voting for. The only 2 I wouldn't would be Santo and Octagon, who I think are only on the list because they were on the one pay-per-view that U.S. people watched.
Mm-hmm.
And the Dinamitas, and I think the Dinamitas might get in even with me not voting for them, but because to me, it was a trio that was building to singles matches. The trio itself was not the draw. So I think if they put CM Curtis back in, I was voting for CM Curtis. I wouldn't vote for a Mascherano or those Mills, or version of those Mills, so it doesn't make sense. But the way we do tag teams and trios on this ballot doesn't seem very consistent to me generally. So I would not be surprised to go in. I would, if I had enough room on the ballot, I would consider Amel Blanco and Dr. Wagner. But again, the same issue where EML did not push tag teams as their own entity. They were tag teams to build to a singles match. Tag teams themselves were not the draw. Jorel Dixon, I thought he's a guy who's more like a compiler of stats than a top guy, who was the focus of his promotion outside maybe like a couple of years near the beginning. He was a guy who had a very long career, was among the top guys, but was really the top guy. So I don't know that I would. I feel like other people would have stronger candidates, and that's against the criteria to say to vote for a guy who's just around for a long time. You want a guy who was at the best for a period, and I'm not sure that Dixon qualifies, even though he's a lot more famous than other people. El Dandy, I think maybe I need to dig more into him on the work case because he has some great matches. He just does not have the drawing that other people did. He came into a period that was not where the promotions were not doing it strongly at the end, and he did not have the great post WCW run that like Parker had and other people had. The one, and then AAA LaParca, I think it's a tough candidate because the work is awful, but and he headlined a lot of shows that did not draw well, but he also headlined a lot of shows that drew very well, and it was like the symbol of its promotion for about a decade. And you could see with AAA about to introduce a new LaParca sometime in the next few months that the character themselves means a lot to promotion. They feel like it's a draw, and his work is part of the reason for that. Psycho Clown and Volador both fit guys that I think cross whatever imaginary threshold is to the Hall of Fame, but they're not overwhelming yet. And I know that the worst that's going to happen is they drop off the ballot and Dave adds them a couple more years, so it doesn't feel like there's a great urgency to both of them, even though I think I would both consider them Hall of Fame people. So that would leave for me.
What's the strongest element of the Volador case? Is it influence, drawing, or in-ring?
It would be in-ring, and so that's a bit polarizing because I know some people are not fans of Boulder's in-ring, but he was a guy who was having great matches from the early 2000s till today. His drawing, he's been part of some big shows, but he's not has not created a boom like other people. His influence, I think, is going to get stronger over time, but it's clear that he's trading a lot of people in CMO, and his class is a place to be in, and they're gaining more influence in the promotion through that time. I think we will be talking more about his influence in about the next 10 years, but right now it's more people imitating him than him being running things backstage. Right?
Okay, cool. Interesting. Final question before I let you go, Cubs. Is there anybody that you really want on the ballot that's not on there currently?
I think I went so long that I forgot to actually tell you who I was going to vote for.
That might be true. Who if you are comfortable saying, who are you voting for?
Right now, and I still may change my mind, but right now for the 4 spots I would have Gran Hamada, of course. I would have Sangri Chikana, who I think was a top drawing star for EML and occasionally UWA in the late 70s through the 80s. He's not in because he starts to fall off right when TV picks up and right when the U.S. interest picks up. And he's a guy who preferred to wrestle in Monterrey, in his hometown in Monterrey, rather than Mexico City at points. So he does not have as much stuff on footage, but the stuff that we've seen, he's like an excellent all-time great brawler. So I think he should be in, and it's an oversight he hasn't been in. I would have Hurricane Ramirez. I think he's a very important character, a very iconic character. He's a guy who does not get enough credit for what he's drawn outside Mexico, but he was a big draw in various South American countries. So I see him in, but I know he's like a borderline for a lot of people. And then the one I'm not sure if I'm going to choose or replace with someone else is Masquerita Sagrada. I think without him, the concept of the minis as they are does not get over. I think he was an incredible wrestler who had to be an incredible wrestler to make the style work, and he's influential in that he opened the door for a lot of other wrestlers who would not have a real chance to be in the wrestling business without them.
Awesome. That's a very strong lineup. Now I ask you the question: is there anybody not on the ballot that you want to see get on there?
There's no one I'm dying to see that has not been in and out the last few years. I think the size that we have it right now is pretty good, especially if you get 1 or 2 people in. But there's no one who's really coming to mind that needs to be on the ballot that I can think of.
Interesting. Mike, let me ask you this before we go. In Japan, I have an answer for this. I want to know where you're at first. Anybody in Japan that you would like to see get added to the ballot?
Oh, Dragon Kid. Dragon Kid deserves an up and down ballot vote. I think that it's kind of funny that we came together to talk about Gran Hamada, who I think has, like, as I've said several times, probably, like, if you're pointing to, like who is responsible for this style, you go back to Gran Hamada and you can start placing other things there. I think that especially in the way that we talk about longevity and his career and his output, Dragon Kid has always kind of been someone that people identify with the promotion, but we now have like evidence of at least 25 years of exceptional junior heavyweight wrestling. He's been recognized for the Dragon Rana several years in a row back in the Wrestling Observer Awards. And then I think that it's really worth getting into the fact that he is responsible in a lot of ways for like being the influence or the spur for a lot of modern Joshi to get into wrestling. I mean, Mayu, Atani, Azumi, the list goes on that only became interested in wrestling because they saw Dragon Kid. So Dragon Kid's the person I would put on in Japan easily. I
would vote for him. You would vote for him. I think Alan would vote for him. I'm not sure anybody else that votes in Japan would vote for him. I think he deserves like an up and down vote. Like, I'm with you. I'm with you. We can't get Shima. We can't get Shima in. It sucks. Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like that this entire genre of wrestling outside of Ultimo, which doesn't totally count because he had all the American exposure that he had. I don't like that this entire... And outside of Okada, who doesn't really count because he was a trainee who got his contract sold. This genre of wrestling is just being shut out of this Hall of Fame, and it drives me nuts. And on that note, the one person I'm going to really ask Dave for to put back on this year, because he was on and then fell off, and I think collectively a few of us last year realized that he wasn't in, and we all just assumed he was. I want Sasuke on the ballot. I don't particularly care about him as an in-ring performer. I would put him in the Japan category, obviously, but I think being the founder and promoter of Peak Michinoku Pro should get you in the Hall of Fame. The first promoter to have a home base outside of Tokyo and to do it in northeastern Japan where he did, and to have the success from 93 to 98 or 99 that he did. Yeah. I feel like that alone gets you in the Hall of Fame. And I've become hyper fixated on this of Sasuke not being in, and, Sasuke the wrestler, cool. Influence, I'm sure, is there. But Sasuke the promoter is the thing that I'm most focused on. And I really think he deserves to be back on the ballot, and I think he deserves to be in the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, because with all the pushing and like not going, that this is not turning into something against shoot style. I mean, how long was the longest successful shoot style promotion?
What, three or 4 years?
So Michinoku Pro has them in that stretch alone during its like peak.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I mean, like if you're talking, and it feels like the loudest voices about this kind of thing are fixated on that style of pro wrestling and that candidacy. I think Sasuke has just as much of an argument if they were using that logic.
I would very much agree with that. Cubs, I can't thank you enough for your time. I really enjoyed your contributions to this discussion. I enjoy your contributions to the wrestling discussion, both contemporary and historical at large. Is there anything else you want to plug or anything else you want to add before we let you go?
I just listening to you and Mike talk about people who should be in. I just thought back to the question again. The person I would have suggested, if you want to do some editing, which you do not, because that's too much work, is Valiente Perez, who was the editor for the El Halcon magazine from the 60s, 70s, 80s. It's like a deep pick that most people would not know, and like he would have less of a chance of getting on the Dragon Kid. But he was, not only does he serve like a Bill After phase of like a guy who was publishing a very famous magazine covering wrestling, he was also a guy who was very clearly working behind the scenes, coming up with gimmicks and coming up with storyline ideas and feeding them to the promotions to make his magazines interesting. He's the guy who came up with the Mill Master gimmick and the Tiniabos gimmick, among others. I think because Mexico and Japan has the same issue where it so flows behind the scenes that the contributors to wrestling in both those scenes who were not in the ring do not give as much attention when it comes to these Hall of Fame discussions, and because there's just not as much known about what they did. But I think there's usually some good candidates in those places.
Would there ever be somebody from like Boxy Lucha that would deserve some sort of recognition? Is there a singular figure there?
I have not discovered a singular figure for that magazine because it changed over so many times, and it's like there's not a person who had the force personality that Perez did with his magazine.
Okay.
So, but it's something that I'm always trying to like read between the lines when I'm reading these magazines, trying to figure out what stories that they're trying to get around about who's actually running things. You could say the influence that the commissioners had and other people had. Perez, among all of them, really stands out.
Was Perez's magazine the one that started the ascent to Huracan Ramirez as well, talking about someone who's on the Mexican side of the ballot? Was that his magazine?
I don't think that was. Well, Huracan Ramirez was more product of the movie that was based on the character before the character became the ring.
Okay, that's fair. It's always with like Ramirez and like I guess he's the case for really like the outside star power, really. Like everyone talks about like the Santo and Blue Demon movies. Was the true product of that in that manner. So yeah.
Yeah. And there were other characters too who were featured in movies and then brought to the ring who did not have the success of Ramirez. So there's something to said for his ability as a worker to make that character continue to be viable even after the movie faded from popularity.
Right on. Well, Cubs, you've got the most active wrestling blog there is. I'm very, very glad it exists. It helps me out every week. Is there anything you want to plug before you go?
Not much. I'm on Twitter for now. I have my blog at luchablog.com. I'm posting some stuff that I never bothered to put on Twitter occasionally, so you should check it out occasionally. But it's just the usual stuff that people use for me.
A valuable resource, Cubs. I can't thank you enough for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Mike is on Twitter at FujiHeya with 2 eyes. I am on Twitter at _InYourCase. New episodes of Open the Voice Gate normally every Tuesday, although we might have some scheduling changes here in the next few weeks. But Cubs, thank you again. Everybody listening, we'll have Jay from Dragon Gate on next week to talk about a bunch of cool Dragon Gate stuff. And thank you to everybody for listening.
Do you like wrestling trivia? Then check out the 5-Star Match Game, the Pro Wrestling Quiz Show. I'm Joe Gagney, and every episode, I grill 3 contestants with 5 rounds of power-packed wrestling trivia. We have over 30 evergreen episodes in the archives covering WWE, AEW, Japan, Mexico, and much, 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 much more. Play along at home and check it out today.